At some point, you've probably noticed it. Not right away, usually only after the third or fourth time. A different name, a different face, a different city sometimes, and yet somehow the same relationship playing out with different actors. The same kind of person who starts out attentive and later turns distant. The same kind of friend who takes more than they give. The same kind of boss who makes you feel exactly as small as the one before. Most people explain this with bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time, a string of unfortunate choices. Carl Jung had a very different explanation, one that doesn't put the blame on luck or even entirely on the other person. He called it a complex, and once you understand how it actually works, you'll start noticing it everywhere, not just in your relationships, but in the jobs you take, the arguments you have, and the way certain rooms make you feel small before anyone's even said a word. This isn't about coincidence. It's about a pattern your own mind is running, mostly outside your awareness, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how to start interrupting it. Think about the last person who hurt you in a way that felt strangely, uncomfortably familiar. Not new pain, old pain wearing a new face. Chances are, if you traced it back far enough, you'd find an earlier version of that exact same hurt showing up years before this person ever entered your life. That's not a coincidence either. That's the pattern showing its work, if you know where to look. Long before Jung developed his theory of the shadow, before he wrote about archetypes or the collective unconscious, he was running word association experiments in a psychiatric clinic in Zurich. The setup was simple. He'd say a word out loud, and the patient had to respond with the first word that came to mind as fast as possible, while Jung measured their reaction time. Most words got an instant, unremarkable response, but every so often a patient would hesitate, stumble, give an odd answer, or physically flinch, all triggered by a word that on the surface seemed completely ordinary. Jung realized he'd found something real. Certain words were snagging on something buried, a cluster of emotionally charged memories and associations that the conscious mind wasn't fully aware of, but that was clearly still active, still running underneath the surface. He called these clusters complexes. Not in the everyday sense of having a complex about your appearance, but in a much more technical sense, an emotionally charged knot of memory, feeling, and expectation, usually formed early, usually around a wound that never fully resolved, that behaves almost like a separate, semi-autonomous piece of your personality. And here's the part that matters most for what we're talking about today. A complex doesn't just sit there quietly. It actively shapes what you notice, who you're drawn to, and how you interpret what's happening around you, all without asking your permission first. If you've ever wondered why certain people feel instantly, inexplicably familiar, sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a way that should have been a warning sign, this is usually why. You're not meeting a stranger. You're meeting someone who fits almost perfectly into a slot your own mind built a long time ago. Jung spent years cataloging these reaction patterns across hundreds of patients, and he noticed something else worth mentioning. Complexes aren't rare or pathological. Everyone has them. Having a complex isn't a sign that something is wrong with you, it's simply a sign that you're a person who grew up somewhere, shaped by specific people, specific wounds, specific unmet needs. The question was never whether you have complexes. It's whether you know what they are and whether you're the one steering or they are. If this is helping you understand a pattern in your own life, subscribe now, because this channel breaks down one piece of Jung's work every week, always explained clearly and applied to something real. Complexes almost always start early, and they almost always start around something unresolved. A parent who was warm sometimes and cold other times, with no predictable pattern to it. A household where conflict meant danger, so you learned to read a room for tension before anyone said a word. A sibling who got the attention you needed and never quite got over not getting it yourself. The child doesn't process this the way an adult would, with language and reflection. The child processes it as a felt sense. This is what love feels like, this is what safety feels like, this is what it feels like right before someone leaves. That felt sense doesn't stay in childhood. It becomes a template, quietly filed away, waiting to be activated again by anything that resembles the original pattern closely enough. This is why complexes are so hard to catch by thinking about them logically. They weren't built with logic. They were built with feeling, at an age before you had the tools to question whether the feeling was actually telling you the truth about the world. And because they were built so early, they don't announce themselves as memories. They show up as instinct, a gut feeling that something is wrong or right before you've consciously processed a single detail. Most people trust that instinct completely, treating it as reliable information about the present moment. Often it is. But sometimes that instinct is really just the complex recognizing familiar terrain and mistaking familiar for safe. Here's where it gets genuinely strange and genuinely useful. A complex doesn't just wait passively for something to trigger it. Jung's later work, and a great deal of psychology since, suggests it actively influences perception, making certain people and situations stand out, almost like they're lit up, while others fade into the background, even when objectively they might be a better fit. This is often what people mistake for chemistry, that instant sense of "I feel like I already know you," that pull that feels too strong to be random. Sometimes that pull is genuine compatibility. But very often, especially when it's that immediate and that intense, it's a complex recognizing its match, a nervous system responding to a pattern it already knows intimately, for better or worse. This explains something that confuses a lot of people about their own relationship history. Why the safe, steady, well-adjusted person often feels boring, while the person who runs hot and cold feels magnetic. The steady person doesn't activate anything. There's no old wound being touched, no familiar shape being traced. The unpredictable person does, and the nervous system reads that activation as intensity, sometimes even as love, when it may really just be recognition. It's worth being precise here. This doesn't mean every strong attraction is a red flag, or that every calm relationship is automatically the healthy choice. Real compatibility exists, and it can feel intense too. The distinction isn't intensity itself, it's where that intensity is coming from, whether it's responding to who this actual person is, or responding to a shape your mind already knew how to recognize before you'd learned anything real about them at all. Take someone who grew up with a parent whose approval always felt just slightly out of reach. Not absent, not cruel, just conditional, warm when things went well, cold and withdrawn when they didn't. That child often grows into an adult with a complex built around earning love through performance. As an adult, that person doesn't consciously seek out emotionally unavailable partners. Nobody does that on purpose. But someone who's warm and consistent from the start doesn't register as compelling because there's no performance required, nothing to prove, nothing to chase. Someone who's a little withholding, a little inconsistent, someone who makes their approval feel like something to be earned, registers as deeply, urgently interesting, familiar in a way that gets mistaken for destiny. The relationship that follows often repeats the original dynamic almost exactly. Trying again to finally earn something that was always just out of reach the first time. Not because the person is choosing badly on purpose, but because the complex is doing the choosing quietly in the background, long before conscious judgment even gets involved. What makes this particularly hard to see from the inside is that each new relationship comes with its own specific details, a different job, a different sense of humor, a different city where you met. Those surface differences make it feel like a brand new story every time. It's only when you zoom out across several relationships at once that the underlying shape becomes obvious, the same emotional distance held out just far enough to keep you reaching for it. Complexes don't stay confined to romantic relationships. They show up just as clearly at work, in friendships, even in how you react to authority figures who have no real power over you at all. Someone with an unresolved complex around a critical parent may find themselves bristling at completely reasonable feedback from a manager, reading criticism into a neutral comment, because some part of their nervous system isn't responding to this manager. It's responding to an old, much more dangerous version of being judged. Someone with a complex around being overlooked as a middle child might find themselves chronically drawn to friendships where they're doing most of the emotional labor and getting the least attention back, recreating, without meaning to, the exact imbalance that hurt the first time. The pattern is the same mechanism every time, just wearing a different outfit depending on the context. A complex gets activated, it distorts perception just slightly, and it pulls you toward a role you already know how to play, even when that role has never actually served you well. This is also why people are often far more insightful about a friend's repeating pattern than their own. From the outside, watching a friend date the same emotionally unavailable type for the third time in a row, the pattern looks almost comically obvious. From the inside, in your own life, that same clarity tends to disappear the moment the complex activates, replaced by a very convincing sense that this time is genuinely different. Here's the part that frustrates a lot of people once they get this far. Simply knowing about a pattern isn't usually enough to stop it. You can understand, intellectually, exactly why you're drawn to a certain type of person, and still feel that same unmistakable pull the next time you meet them. Jung was clear about why. A complex isn't a belief you can argue yourself out of. It's closer to a conditioned response held in the body as much as in the mind. Insight matters, it's the necessary first step, but insight alone doesn't unwind decades of a nervous system treating a certain kind of unpredictability as the definition of love. This is why understanding a pattern and actually changing it are two different jobs, and why so many people can accurately describe their own pattern in detail, sometimes for years, without it losing any of its pull. The knowing has to eventually turn into a different kind of noticing, one that happens in real time, not just in hindsight. Jung's own approach to this took years of patient, deliberate work with each individual, precisely because he understood there was no shortcut. He never promised his patients a quick fix once they identified their complex, only a clearer map of the terrain they'd now have to actually walk through, differently, one choice at a time. So what does it actually look like to start interrupting this in real time? A few concrete signals to watch for starting this week. First, pay attention to the speed of the pull. Genuine compatibility tends to build gradually over repeated exposure as you actually get to know someone. A complex tends to activate almost instantly, that overwhelming sense of this feels like fate within the first conversation or two. Fast and overwhelming isn't proof of anything bad, but it's worth treating as a flag to slow down and watch, rather than a green light to fully commit. Second, notice if the pull comes with a specific kind of anxiety, the fear of losing access to this person's approval. That particular flavor of anxiety, not just normal nervousness, but a felt sense of needing to secure something that feels like it could be taken away at any moment, is one of the clearest signatures of an old complex being activated rather than simple attraction. Third, look at your reaction the moment someone treats you with uncomplicated, consistent kindness. If it feels flat or slightly suspicious or genuinely boring, that reaction is worth examining closely. It's often not a sign that the person is actually boring. It's a sign that your nervous system doesn't yet recognize steady kindness as safe, because it doesn't match the old template closely enough to register as significant. Fourth, track your patterns across time, not just within one relationship. Keep a private, honest list of the 2 or 3 qualities that show up again and again in the people or situations that hurt you. That short list is usually a very direct map to the complex underneath. None of these 4 signals are meant to turn you into someone who overanalyzes every new connection before it has a chance to breathe. That would just create a different kind of problem. The goal is narrower than that. Building just enough awareness that, in the moment the old pull shows up, you have a half-second of choice you didn't have before, instead of sliding straight into the familiar script on autopilot. Once you can name the pattern, the next step isn't to force yourself to feel differently. That rarely works and usually backfires. The more reliable approach is to deliberately choose behavior that doesn't match the old script, even while the old feeling is still fully present. That might mean staying in a conversation with someone steady and consistent, even though part of you is bored, instead of drifting toward the person who feels more urgent. It might mean noticing the anxious pull to over-explain yourself to someone whose approval feels conditional, and choosing to say less instead of more, just to see what happens when you don't perform for it. This is uncomfortable on purpose. You're asking a nervous system that learned its lessons early and thoroughly to tolerate a new kind of evidence that safety can also feel calm instead of just familiar. That discomfort isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. It's usually a sign the old complex is losing a little bit of its automatic authority over your choices. Over time, with enough repetition, the new pattern doesn't just get tolerated, it starts to actually feel like relief instead of deprivation. That shift is usually gradual, and it's usually the clearest sign that real change, not just insight, is actually taking hold. There's no fixed timeline for this. For some people it takes months, for others considerably longer, especially if the complex was formed very early or reinforced across many years. What matters more than speed is consistency, choosing the new response often enough, even imperfectly, that it eventually becomes its own kind of familiar, one your nervous system can finally trust as much as it used to trust the old one. One more thing worth saying clearly, because it changes how this whole process feels to go through. None of this means you were foolish for falling into the same pattern before. A complex isn't a character flaw. It's evidence that, at some point, you adapted intelligently to a situation that genuinely needed adapting to. The child who learned to earn love through performance wasn't making a mistake. they were surviving a household where love actually did feel conditional. The pattern made sense given what you had to work with at the time. It only becomes a problem later, when the situation has changed, but the old script keeps running anyway, applied to people and circumstances where it no longer fits. Recognizing that difference, this made sense then, and it doesn't have to run the show now, tends to make the whole process feel less like self-criticism and more like updating an old set of instructions that simply hasn't caught up with your actual life yet. Jung himself was careful never to frame this work as a battle against yourself. He described it as more of a conversation, an ongoing one, between the part of you that adapted brilliantly to survive something difficult and the part of you that's now old enough and safe enough to consider a different way of living. Both parts deserve some patience along the way. The people, jobs, and situations that keep repeating in your life aren't proof that you're unlucky or that you keep choosing badly on purpose. They're a map pointing directly at the part of you that's still waiting for something old to finally get resolved. Jung's point was never that these patterns make you broken. It was that they make you legible if you're willing to actually look. The moment you can name the shape of what you keep attracting, you've already taken the hardest step, because most people spend years living out the pattern without ever seeing it clearly enough to name it at all. If this helped you recognize something about your own patterns, subscribe, because next week we're looking at another piece of Jung's work, one that explains why some people seem to grow through hardship while others just get harder. And before you go, what's the pattern you keep noticing in relationships, at work, or in friendships that you've never quite traced back to its source? Leave it in the comments. Naming it out loud is usually the first real step toward changing it. Jung spent a lifetime returning to this same basic idea that the parts of ourselves we understand least are usually the parts running the most of the show. That's not a reason for despair. It's simply where the actual work begins, a little more clearly every time you're willing to look.